Disabled CEO rejected. On a Christmas blind date, until a little boy asked, "Can you be my dad?" He was a successful CEO, but after a devastating accident, he's left isolated and rejected. On a Christmas blind date, he's humiliated when she walks out, unable to look past his disability. But just as he's about to give up on love, a little boy sitting nearby asks, "Can you be my dad?" Suddenly, everything changes. The boy's mother, a single mum with a heartbreaking past, never expected that one question would lead to a new family. As their bond deepens, an unexpected enemy emerges, her abusive ex-husband, threatening to tear it all apart. Will he be able to protect the family he never thought he wanted? Or is love too fragile to survive the past? Can this broken CEO find redemption and a family this Christmas? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Mason Clark sat at the corner booth of the upscale restaurant, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his wine glass. Christmas lights twinkled around him, casting a warm glow over the crowded room, but he felt no warmth. It had been a long time since he felt the simple joy of the holidays, and even longer since he'd felt like the man he used to be. Once a confident CEO with a thriving business, Mason had become a shadow of himself after the car accident that left him paralyzed. He adjusted the collar of his navy blue blazer, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. His friends had convinced him to try a blind date. It had been nearly a year since his last attempt at a relationship, and that ended with nothing but empty promises and unspoken words. But this time, maybe it would be different. Natalie, his date for the evening, had agreed to meet him here at 7. As the clock ticked towards that hour, Mason tried to remind himself that this was just another night, another chance to get back into the world he had so unceremoniously been cast out of. But when she walked in, everything shifted. Mason's heart skipped a beat as he watched Natalie step into the restaurant. She was beautiful, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders in soft waves, and her bright red dress hugged her figure perfectly. For a moment, he was mesmerized by the way she moved, so confident, so effortlessly graceful. But then, as her eyes scanned the room, they landed on him, and something flickered in her gaze, something he couldn't quite read. She froze for a second, hesitation in her posture. It was brief, but it was there. He could feel the air between them shift, thick with the weight of an unspoken judgment. She took a deep breath and approached, forcing a smile. "Hi, Mason," she said, her voice warm but strained. "It's good to meet you." He rose to greet her, offering a polite smile. His hand reached out, but before he could offer it, Natalie glanced at the empty chair. Across from him, a barely perceptible wrinkle forming between her brows. "Is everything okay?" Mason asked, trying to push down the rising unease in his chest. "Yeah, of course," she replied quickly, too quickly. She sat down, but there was a distance between them. A wall. An invisible barrier he couldn't break. They sat in silence for a moment, the awkward tension thickening with every passing second. Mason did his best to focus on the menu in front of him, as if it could somehow distract him from the feeling of being scrutinized. He tried to be charming, tried to make her laugh, but every word felt forced. He knew she was uncomfortable. He could see it in the way she shifted in her seat, in the way her fingers tapped nervously on the edge of her glass. "I'm sorry," Natalie said suddenly, breaking the silence. I didn't think this would be so difficult." Mason looked up, confused. She met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw the discomfort that had been quietly hanging in the air. "I'm sorry, but I don't think this is going to work," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He had been rejected before, but it had always been more subtle, more polite. This was different. This was an outright dismissal. She began, her voice faltering. I don't think I can do this. You're just not what I was expecting. Mason's breath caught in his throat. I'm not. What? She looked away, her fingers tightly gripping her glass. I'm sorry, I really am. It's just, I've always been with someone who's whole. I mean, you're a great guy, I'm sure, but I just can't. He nodded, trying to keep his face neutral, though inside a storm was raging. She was right. He was different now, broken. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, the truth was undeniable. The woman he had hoped to connect with, to maybe even find some semblance of normalcy with, had just confirmed his worst fear. He wasn't good enough anymore. I understand, Mason said, his voice tight. It's okay. He reached for his wallet, offering to pay for their drinks. But she shook her head. No, she said, standing up quickly. I'll take care of it. I'm really sorry. I have to go. And without another word, she turned and walked away. Mason sat back in his seat, the empty space across from him feeling larger than ever. He stared at the half-empty glass of wine in front of him, the red liquid swirling in the glass as his hand trembled slightly. A waiter came by, offering a polite smile before turning away, but Mason didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the dark corner of his thoughts, trying to shake the sting of rejection that had settled deep inside him. The restaurant continued around him, laughter, clinking glasses, families and couples enjoying the holiday. And yet, he felt completely isolated. As the minutes stretched on, Mason looked up again, and that's when he noticed them. A small family was sitting a few tables away. A young boy, no older than 6, was playing quietly with a toy in his lap. He was dressed in a cozy sweater and jeans, his eyes wide and innocent. Beside him sat his mother, a woman who couldn't have been more than 30, her face weary but gentle, her eyes soft with the kind of exhaustion that only single parents know. Mason's heart ached at the sight of them. He wondered what it would be like to have that kind of life again, to be part of something. But his thoughts were interrupted when the little boy suddenly turned his gaze to him, their eyes locking for a moment. "Can you be my dad?" the boy asked, his voice cutting through the noise around them like a knife. Mason froze. The words hung in the air like a question he had never expected to hear. And yet somehow, in that moment, they felt like a lifeline he wasn't sure he was ready to grab. The words still lingered in the air, echoing in Mason's mind. "Can you be my dad?" The little boy sat there, his wide eyes looking up at him with innocent curiosity. Mason felt a strange tightness in his chest. He was still processing what had just happened with Natalie, the sting of her rejection lingering. But now, this boy, this child, was offering him something he never thought he'd want. A father? His gaze shifted to the woman seated beside him, the boy's mother. She looked mortified, her face flushed with embarrassment. She quickly leaned down to the boy, her hand resting on his shoulder as she whispered something in his ear. The boy nodded, his attention still fixed on Mason. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, her voice soft but filled with regret. He's just very honest." She didn't meet Mason's eyes. Instead, she focused on her son, gently pulling him into her arms. Mason cleared his throat, trying to collect himself. He couldn't help but smile, though the situation was undeniably awkward. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than usual. "No harm done." She seemed relieved, but there was a hesitation in her eyes, as if she were unsure of how to proceed. Mason didn't blame her. He was just as unsure of what was going on. He had been on the receiving end of rejection for so long that it felt surreal to have someone, especially a child, extend such an innocent, unguarded request. The boy, oblivious to the tension, smiled up at Mason. "You look nice," he said, his tone hopeful. Mason chuckled, feeling a strange warmth stir in his chest. "Thanks," he replied, unsure of what else to say. The woman finally looked up at Mason, offering a small, apologetic smile. "He means no harm. He's just always wanted a dad, someone to play with, someone to look up to." Mason nodded, his mind racing. He could relate to that feeling, having someone to look up to guide you, to help you navigate life. But he wasn't sure how he fit into that equation, especially with his own struggles. He didn't even know if he was capable of being the kind of person this boy needed. "Is everything okay?" Mason asked, his voice gentle. He couldn't help but feel a pull towards them, as if the universe had thrown him this curveball for a reason. The woman hesitated before answering, her gaze falling to her lap. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly, "and this is Ethan." She glanced at her son, who was still smiling at Mason, and then back at him, her expression shifting from embarrassed to something else. Vulnerability, maybe? Or perhaps exhaustion. I didn't expect to be talking about all this with a stranger," she admitted. "I'm sorry, it's been a rough few years." Mason raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. The weight in her voice told him there was more to the story than she was letting on, but he didn't want to press her. Still, he couldn't ignore the pull he felt to help. "No need to apologize," Mason said. He glanced at Ethan, who had returned to his toy, his attention now diverted. "You've got a good kid here." Sarah gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He's a good boy. I don't know how to do all this on my own. Sometimes I wish I had someone who could help." Mason felt a pang in his chest. The words resonated deeply with him, as he knew all too well what it felt like to be alone, physically, emotionally, and mentally. He'd been fighting his own battles for a long time, but here, in this moment, he realized something. Maybe he didn't need to fight alone anymore. "I can help," Mason said before he even fully understood the weight of his own words. Sarah looked at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, followed by caution. She probably didn't trust anyone easily, and Mason couldn't blame her. It wasn't often people offered help without expecting something in return. And Mason, though he was drawn to her and Ethan, knew he had his own vulnerabilities. He didn't know if he could be what they needed. But there was something about Sarah, something that made him feel like he had to do this. Maybe it was the softness in her voice when she spoke about Ethan, or the way she had reacted when Ethan asked about him. She was a woman doing the best she could, struggling in silence. Maybe they both were. Sarah seemed to consider his words for a long moment, but then she shook her head slightly. "I don't want to burden you," she said quietly. We're fine. Really, I've got it under control." Mason didn't buy it. He had seen enough of the world to know when someone was hiding their pain, but he also understood that asking for help wasn't easy. It took vulnerability, a strength most people didn't know they had until it was too late. "No burden," Mason replied with quiet conviction. "Sometimes we all need a little help. No shame in that." Sarah met his gaze then, and for the first time, she really looked at him, her eyes soft, but full of something Mason couldn't quite place. Was it hope? Fear? He couldn't tell. But whatever it was, it made his heart beat just a little faster. "Well," she said, standing up with a small sigh, "thank you for being understanding. We should probably get going. Ethan still has some energy to burn. She smiled at her son, who was now busily organizing his toy cars on the table. Mason stood as well, not ready to let the moment slip away just yet. Would you like to get some coffee sometime? He instantly regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth, feeling self-conscious about the invitation. He wasn't sure what he was asking for, only that he wanted to see her again, to help however he could. Sarah looked at him for a moment, and Mason could see the hesitation in her eyes. Finally, she gave a small nod. Maybe. I'll think about it. Mason felt a small sense of relief, even if it wasn't a clear yes. At least she hadn't turned him away completely. As they left the restaurant, Mason's thoughts swirled. He had never expected to meet someone like Sarah and Ethan tonight, but now that he had, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something important, something life-changing. Maybe he wasn't as broken as he thought. Mason watched as Sarah and Ethan disappeared into the night, the streetlights casting long shadows as they walked down the sidewalk. He felt a strange sense of hope stirring in his chest, the first glimmer of something positive in a long time. Maybe this Christmas wouldn't be so lonely after all. But as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him back to reality. He pulled it out only to see a message from his lawyer, one that he had been dreading. His business was facing a major setback, and he had to make a decision quickly. For a moment, Mason felt the weight of it all, his past, his present, and the uncertain future that awaited him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow things were starting to fall into place. He couldn't help but wonder, could this little boy, this family, help him find the answers he needed? And more importantly, could he be the man they needed him to be? He didn't know yet, but he was willing to try. The days after Mason met Sarah and Ethan felt surreal, almost like a dream. He had spent so many months in isolation, focusing on his work, keeping himself busy with business matters. But now, there was a new presence in his life. A presence he couldn't ignore. Every time he thought about Sarah and Ethan, something stirred in him, a mixture of hope, uncertainty, and a longing for connection. It had been 2 days since their brief meeting at the restaurant. Mason found himself unable to stop thinking about their conversation. Ethan's innocent question, "Can you be my dad?" echoed in his mind. It was a question that seemed impossible, yet somehow it made sense. The boy was just looking for someone to love him, to fill the emptiness he clearly felt. And in that moment, Mason realized he wasn't just looking for a relationship with Sarah. He was longing to be part of something real, something that mattered. Mason had hesitated to reach out after the coffee invitation, unsure of whether it was too forward, but he finally decided to send Sarah a text message the next morning. "Hey, it was great meeting you and Ethan the other night. I hope you both are doing well. Would you be open to meeting for coffee this weekend? No pressure, just thought it might be nice to chat again." The response didn't come immediately, and Mason, though anxious, tried to stay calm. He had to remind himself that he couldn't rush things. He had spent years building walls around his heart, and now, just as he was starting to feel something, he wasn't about to tear them down all at once. It was late afternoon when Sarah finally replied. "Thanks for reaching out. I think coffee sounds nice. How about Saturday afternoon?" Mason couldn't help but smile as he read the message. His fingers hovered over the screen as he quickly typed back. "Saturday sounds perfect. I'll pick you both up at 2. When Sarah agreed, Mason's heart lifted. It was a small step, but it was something. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of anticipation. Saturday arrived, and Mason found himself standing in front of the mirror in his apartment, adjusting his shirt for what felt like the 10th time. He wasn't nervous, not exactly, but he couldn't deny the flutter of excitement in his chest. A coffee date. It seemed so simple, yet everything about it felt new and significant. For so long, Mason had avoided situations like this, unsure of what he had to offer. But now, with Sarah and Ethan, it was different. When he arrived at Sarah's apartment, he found her waiting outside with Ethan in tow. The boy ran up to Mason excitedly, his eyes bright with hope. "Are we going to the coffee shop now?" Ethan asked, looking up at Mason with that same innocent smile that had melted Mason's heart the first time they met. Mason chuckled and crouched down to the boy's level. "Yes, we are. Ready for some hot chocolate?" Ethan's face lit up. "Yes, please." Sarah, standing a few steps behind Ethan, offered a small but genuine smile. There was a warmth in her eyes now that had been absent the last time they'd spoken. She seemed more relaxed, less guarded. "Thanks for doing this," Sarah said softly, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I wasn't sure if this was something you were serious about." Mason shrugged, trying to keep things light. "Well, I said I'd help. And besides, I haven't had the chance to meet many people outside of work lately. It's nice to have a change." She laughed softly, and for a moment, Mason could see the layers of stress and exhaustion start to melt away from her face. They were both so different from each other, yet somehow they were drawn together by something neither of them fully understood. The drive to the coffee shop was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Mason found himself stealing glances at Sarah in the rearview mirror, wondering how someone so strong and capable could carry so much pain without anyone to lean on. He could sense it in her struggle to maintain control, to keep everything together for Ethan, despite the fact that she had so many pieces of herself left broken. When they arrived at the coffee shop, the cozy atmosphere inside felt like the perfect contrast to the cold winter air outside. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries filled the space, and Mason could hear the low murmur of conversations around them. It felt normal, simple, the kind of moment he had once taken for granted. They sat down at a small corner table, and Ethan immediately started chatting away, asking Mason all sorts of questions about his wheelchair and whether he could do cool tricks. Sarah listened intently, her smile soft but distracted. Mason couldn't help but notice the faint lines of worry on her face. She was trying to be present, but he could tell she was weighed down by something. "So, how have things been?" Mason asked, after a few moments of light conversation with Ethan. His voice was gentle, his gaze focused on Sarah. Sarah hesitated before answering, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Busy," she said quietly. "It's always busy, trying to balance everything. I don't have a lot of help and... well, I'm trying to keep it all together, but sometimes it's hard." Mason nodded, understanding more than she realized. The weight of responsibility, of carrying the burden alone, was something he was all too familiar with. He knew the feeling of having to keep everything running smoothly, even when it felt like you were on the edge of breaking. "You're doing your best," Mason said, his voice steady. "And that's more than enough. I'm sure Ethan knows how much you love him, how hard you work for him." Sarah glanced at him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she murmured. "It's just hard sometimes, when it feels like no one sees the struggle." Mason didn't know what to say in that moment. He understood her pain, but he couldn't pretend to know exactly what she was going through. Still, there was something in his heart that urged him to try, to offer the support she needed, even if it was just by listening. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Ethan's excitement for the hot chocolate and the toys at the cafe distracted them all. Mason found himself relaxing. The weight of the world momentarily lifted. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of belonging, They spent the next hour chatting, laughing, and watching Ethan explore the coffee shop's small toy section. By the time they left, it felt like they had known each other far longer than just a few hours. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, a step toward something Mason had never expected to find. When Sarah and Ethan said their goodbyes, Mason felt a strange sense of loss. He had hoped that today would go well, but now, as he watched them walk away, he realized how much he had already come to care for them. As he drove home, his thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. Was he ready for this? Ready for a new kind of life, a new kind of family? One thing was certain. He wasn't willing to let them go, not without giving it his all. Mason pulled into his parking spot outside his apartment, his mind still racing. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. Hope for something beyond the business meetings, the loneliness, and the emptiness that had defined his life for so long. Sarah and Ethan had given him a glimpse into a world he never thought he'd be part of. And though he wasn't sure how it would all unfold, he knew one thing for certain. He was going to fight for them. Mason spent the next few days in a daze, replaying his time with Sarah and Ethan over and over again in his mind. There was something about the way Ethan's eyes sparkled when he looked at him, the way Sarah's smile reached her eyes in those quiet moments that made Mason feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, a sense of possibility that he had almost forgotten existed. But despite the warmth of their company, there was an undeniable weight pressing on him, one that he couldn't shake. He had promised himself he would never put anyone else in a position to care for him, not since the accident. But the more he spent time with Sarah and Ethan, the more that promise seemed to contradict what his heart wanted. The Christmas decorations that adorned his apartment, though beautiful, felt cold in the dim lighting. Mason could feel their emptiness now, the silence that clung to the walls. It had been easy to convince himself that he didn't need anyone, that his work and solitude were enough. But after meeting Sarah and Ethan, he couldn't ignore the ache for something more. At work, things were no better. The stress of running his company weighed on him, each phone call and meeting a reminder of the life he used to lead. Before the accident, before everything changed. But now, it felt distant, like an old memory. The sharp focus he once had in the boardroom had dulled, replaced by the nagging thought of how different everything could be if he embraced the future, the family he had never expected. On Thursday afternoon, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "Hey Mason, I was wondering if you could help us with something. It's a small thing, really, but I could use a hand." Mason's heart skipped. She needed him. For something small? Or perhaps something larger? He didn't care. He quickly typed back, "Of course. What do you need?" Her response came just as quickly. "There's a leaky faucet in the kitchen. It's been dripping for days, and I just haven't had time to deal with it. Would you mind coming by tomorrow? I promise I won't take up too much of your time." Mason's lips tugged into a smile, though it was faint. It was a small task, but somehow it meant everything. She was trusting him enough to let him into her space, into her life. "I'll be there. I've got the tools ready." The next day, Mason arrived at Sarah's apartment right on time, his toolbox in hand. The building was small, tucked away in a quieter part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was clear that Sarah had made it a home for herself and Ethan. The windowsills were decorated with handmade crafts, and there were little touches of holiday cheer throughout. Nothing extravagant, but everything was warm and inviting. It was different from his cold, sterile apartment, filled with all the trappings of wealth but lacking anything real, anything that felt like home. Sarah greeted him at the door, her smile tired but genuine. "Thanks for coming by," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan's with his friend down the hall, so it's just us for now. Mason nodded, following her to the kitchen. It was small, functional, but the faucet sat at the far end of the sink, leaking steadily. As he set his toolbox down, Sarah leaned against the counter, watching him. "You're probably wondering why I didn't call a professional," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I don't always have the money for that kind of thing." Mason turned to face her, his heart aching for her more than he could put into words. It was a simple thing, a leaky faucet, but the weight behind it, the quiet desperation of trying to make ends meet alone, was what struck him. He realized that her pride, her strength, was something that hid the true vulnerability she felt. "No need to apologize," Mason replied gently. "I don't mind. Plus, it's an easy fix." He started working, his hands moving methodically as he tightened the pipes and checked the connections. As he worked, Sarah stayed close by, her arms crossed, her posture stiff. She didn't speak much, but Mason could tell she was still carrying something heavy. He could feel it in the way she looked at him, as though she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Finally, after a few moments of silence, Sarah spoke. "I didn't mean to push you away the other day," she said quietly, almost apologetically. I've been doing this on my own for so long, I didn't know how to let anyone in. I didn't want to ask for help. I didn't want you to think that I was weak." Mason stopped for a moment, looking up at her. There was so much honesty in her words, and so much fear. He could see the battle inside her, the desire to connect, but the fear of being hurt again. He understood that. He had been running from his own pain for so long, afraid to let anyone in, but now he realized that the walls he had built were only keeping him isolated. "You're not weak," Mason said softly. "I don't think anyone who's been through what you've been through could ever be weak. It takes strength to keep going, even when everything feels like it's falling apart." Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback by his words. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then stopped. Instead, she just nodded slowly, her eyes filling with something, maybe relief, maybe the first hint of trust. Mason finished the fix, standing up straight and wiping his hands on a rag. "All done," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "That should hold for a while." "Thank you," Sarah said again, her voice soft. She glanced at him, and there was something in her eyes, something that made Mason's heart beat a little faster. She wasn't just thanking him for fixing the faucet. She was thanking him for showing up, for offering more than just help with plumbing. As Mason gathered his tools, he looked at her one more time. "I'm here, Sarah," he said quietly. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." She nodded, the weight of his words settling between them. "I will," she said, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of uncertainty there. Before Mason left, Ethan came bounding into the room, his excitement palpable. "Did you fix the sink, Mason?" he asked eagerly. Mason chuckled, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Yep, all fixed up." Ethan beamed, his wide smile infectious. "Thanks, you're like a superhero." Mason laughed, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Just doing what I can," he said, his voice soft, full of meaning. As he said his goodbyes and stepped out into the cold evening air, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just a few short days. Sarah was starting to let him in, and Ethan had already made him feel like part of the family. For the first time in a long time, Mason didn't feel alone. There was a sense of purpose in his chest, a growing realization that maybe he could have a place in their lives. But just as quickly as that warmth filled him, doubt crept in. He didn't know how to navigate this new chapter. Would Sarah truly let him in? Or was he just setting himself up for another painful rejection? Mason got into his car and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared out at the darkening city. The cold night air filtered through the cracked window, but it wasn't enough to cool the fire that had ignited inside him. He had been so sure that his life was over, that the pain and isolation were his only companions. But Sarah and Ethan had shown him something different, something better, and he wasn't about to let that go without a fight. But the question still lingered in his mind. Could he really be the man they needed him to be? The days that followed Mason's visit to Sarah's apartment were quiet, but not in the way he had grown used to. The silence in his life had once felt oppressive, like a weight he couldn't shake. But now, with Sarah and Ethan in his thoughts, the quiet felt different. It felt like a moment of anticipation, as though something important was just beyond his reach, waiting for him to take that first step toward it. Mason had made a promise to himself, to help, to be there for them. But what did that mean? He wasn't exactly sure. He had no roadmap for how to become the person they needed, especially after years of being emotionally withdrawn. He'd spent so much time trying to protect himself from the possibility of pain that he had forgotten what it felt like to care deeply for someone else. But now, with Sarah's quiet strength and Ethan's pure-hearted need, he found himself opening up in ways he hadn't thought possible. On Saturday afternoon, Mason found himself at a crossroads. He had just finished a long day of work and was sitting at his desk, staring out at the city. The skyline gleamed in the distance, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. But all he could think about was Sarah's quiet gratitude when he had fixed the faucet. Her soft smile, her hesitant trust, had stayed with him. He glanced at his phone. A message from Sarah flashed across the screen. "Hey, I hope you're doing well. Ethan was asking when we can see you again. We were thinking of going to the park this afternoon, if you'd like to join us." Mason's heart skipped. Ethan wanted to see him again. That alone was enough to make him feel like he was part of something. Something real. He didn't hesitate this time, like he had the first time he sent a message to Sarah. He quickly typed back, "I'd love to join you both. What time should I be there?" The response was immediate. "We'll be there at 3. Hope to see you soon." Mason didn't waste any time. He stood up from his desk, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the door. As he walked to his car, his mind raced. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he wasn't ready for anything like this, that he didn't have the capacity for a relationship, especially with a woman and child who was so different from anything he had known before. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. It didn't matter that he wasn't perfect, that he didn't have all the answers. What mattered was that he showed up. For them. For Sarah. For Ethan. The park was peaceful when Mason arrived, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. Children ran and played, their laughter filling the air. He spotted Sarah and Ethan near a bench, just by the swings. Ethan was energetically, jumping in and out of the sandbox, his cheeks rosy from the brisk December air. Sarah sat nearby, watching him with a warm, tired smile on her face. Mason approached them slowly, taking in the scene. It was simple, almost idyllic, and it made his heart ache in the most unexpected way. This was what he had been missing. This was the life he had forgotten to look for. Ethan spotted him first. "Mason!" he shouted, running toward him with open arms, his face alight with excitement. Mason bent down, just in time to catch the boy in a big bear hug. "Hey there, buddy," he said with a laugh, lifting Ethan off the ground and spinning him around before gently setting him back down. Ethan giggled, his small hand reaching up to hold Mason's. "Do you want to play with me?" he asked, eyes wide with expectation. Mason looked over at Sarah, who was watching them with a smile that was both tender and cautious. It was clear that she appreciated the bond forming between her son and Mason, but there was also a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I think I'd love to play," Mason said, giving Sarah a reassuring nod. "What are we playing?" Ethan's face lit up. "We're building a fort," he declared, tugging Mason toward the sandbox. As Mason settled down in the sand, pulling his legs into a comfortable position, he realized something. It didn't matter that he was in a wheelchair, or that he wasn't the ideal version of himself that he had once envisioned. What mattered was the way he felt right now, connected, engaged, needed. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The afternoon passed quickly. They built an elaborate fort out of sand, decorated it with twigs and leaves, and laughed as they pretended it was a castle under siege. Sarah joined in, helping to carry more sand and offering advice on how to make the walls stronger. The three of them worked together, their teamwork effortless and full of joy. After a while, they took a break, sitting on the grass and watching the sun dip lower in the sky. Ethan, exhausted but happy, leaned against Mason as they all relaxed. "This is fun," Ethan said softly, his eyes half closed. "I wish we could do this every day." Mason smiled, looking at Sarah. There was something about her, something that made him want to be better, to be there for her and Ethan in ways he never thought possible. "I wouldn't mind that," Mason said quietly. "I think I could get used to it." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him. Her expression was unreadable at first, but as she met his gaze, there was a subtle change in her demeanor, a flicker of hope, maybe, or the beginning of trust. "Thank you, Mason," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "For today, for being here. I know I don't always make it easy to connect, but you've been really good to us." Mason felt his chest tighten with emotion. It wasn't just about fixing things or offering help. It was about showing up, about being present. And somehow, that was enough. "I'm just glad I could be here," Mason replied, his voice steady but full of feeling. "You both mean more to me than I expected." There was a long pause, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It didn't need to be said. They both knew the unspoken truth that had quietly started to grow between them. And for the first time, Mason didn't feel the need to rush or hide. He was exactly where he needed to be. As they left the park, Ethan's hand tightly gripping his, Mason couldn't help but glance at Sarah one more time. The soft glow of the fading sun illuminated her face, and for a moment he saw her for who she truly was. A woman who had been through so much, but who was still willing to open her heart to others. He didn't know what the future held, but he was certain of one thing. This was only the beginning. Whatever came next, Mason was ready. Ready to fight for what he wanted, ready to be the man Sarah and Ethan needed. And maybe, just maybe, they would teach him what it really meant to live again. The days that followed their time at the park felt like a new chapter in Mason's life. It wasn't that he had been waiting for something to happen. It was that, somehow, something already had. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden dramatic shift. It was the small moments, the quiet exchanges, the way Ethan smiled at him as if he were already a part of the family. The way Sarah's gaze lingered just a little longer than before. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he couldn't deny the feeling of warmth that settled deep in his chest every time he saw them. Mason had been alone for so long, drowning himself in the demands of his company, using work as a shield to protect himself from the vulnerability of connecting with others. But with Sarah and Ethan, he realized how much he had missed out on, how much he had been hiding from the world and from himself. He still struggled with his disability. The physical limitations were a constant reminder of everything he had lost, but lately he was beginning to see his life in a different light. Instead of focusing on what he couldn't do, he found himself thinking about what he could offer: a listening ear, a compassionate heart, and the time to be there for someone who needed him. On a chilly Thursday afternoon, Mason sat in his office, staring at his computer screen, but his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't seen Sarah and Ethan in a few days, and he found himself thinking about them constantly. There was something about being with them that made everything else seem less important. The stresses of running a business, the endless meetings, the constant pressure, it all felt so distant when he was with them. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "Mason, we're having a small Christmas dinner this weekend, just us. Would you like to join us? It would mean a lot to Ethan." The words hit him like a wave, and for a moment he simply stared at the message. It wasn't a big event, just a quiet, intimate dinner, but the invitation felt like so much more. It felt like a step forward, a sign that Sarah was beginning to trust him, to let him into her life in a way that was more than just casual. "I'd love to join you," he quickly typed back, his fingers moving faster than he could think. "What time should I be there?" The response came almost immediately. "Around 6? We'll be ready by then. I'm looking forward to it." Mason sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He hadn't realized how much he wanted this, how much he longed to be a part of their lives. For so long he had kept himself isolated, afraid of the pain that came with getting close to others. But now he was ready to face whatever came next. Saturday evening arrived quickly. Mason found himself standing in front of his mirror, adjusting his shirt and checking his appearance for the 100th time. He had spent so much time worrying about his disability, about how people saw him, but tonight felt different. It wasn't about appearances, it was about showing up, about being present for Sarah and Ethan. He wanted to be there for them, to prove that he was more than just a man in a wheelchair, more than his circumstances. Tonight, he was just Mason, someone who cared about them and wanted to be part of their lives. As he drove to Sarah's apartment, his nerves started to settle. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this was a step forward, a moment that could change everything. When he arrived, the lights from the apartment window glowed warmly against the night, and the scent of home-cooked food wafted through the air. Ethan was the first to greet him. As usual, running up to Mason with excitement. "You came! You really came!" the boy exclaimed, his face lighting up. Mason smiled and bent down to ruffle Ethan's hair. "Of course I came, buddy. I wouldn't miss this." Sarah appeared in the doorway just behind Ethan, her smile warm and welcoming. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said softly. "I know it's not much, but we're happy to have you here." "It looks perfect," Mason replied, glancing around the cozy living room. It was simple, but filled with warmth, a tree in the corner, adorned with handmade decorations, and a table set for 3, complete with candles and soft music playing in the background. "It's nothing fancy," Sarah said, stepping aside to let him in. "But it's ours." Mason walked in, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't about the grand gestures, the showy displays. It was about the quiet moments, the shared space, the small traditions that made it a home. They all sat down at the table together, and for the next hour they ate, laughed, and shared stories. Ethan chatted about his day at school, asking Mason about all sorts of things. His favorite food, whether he could do tricks in his wheelchair, what his favorite movie was. Sarah joined in the conversation, her laughter echoing in the room, her earlier exhaustion replaced by a sense of peace that Mason hadn't seen before. It was simple. It was real. And Mason found himself enjoying every moment of it. As the evening wore on, Sarah got up to clear the table, leaving Mason and Ethan alone for a moment. The boy, ever the curious one, looked up at Mason with wide eyes. "You're really nice," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I think you're a good dad." Mason's heart caught in his throat. He had never expected to hear those words, not from a child. He wasn't Ethan's father, not in the traditional sense. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The boy saw him, saw the care and love he had for both of them. And that was enough. "I'm glad you think so, Ethan," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a really good kid, too." Ethan smiled, his eyes sparkling with an innocence that Mason couldn't help but admire. "Maybe you can be my dad for real," the boy said with a hopeful grin. Mason laughed softly, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know what the future held, or how everything would unfold, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't running from the possibility of pain or rejection. He was facing it head on, and in doing so, he was learning to be vulnerable again. When Sarah returned, she noticed the quiet exchange between Mason and Ethan. She didn't say anything, but the look she gave him was enough, a mix of gratitude, understanding, and something deeper, something that Mason didn't quite have a name for yet. As the evening came to a close and they all stood at the door to say goodbye, Mason realized something that he hadn't allowed himself to admit before. This family, this moment, it was everything he had been looking for. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real. And that was enough. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly as she stood beside him, her voice full of emotion. "For everything." Mason nodded, his heart full. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad to be here." As he walked out into the night, the sound of Ethan's voice and Sarah's soft laughter still lingering in his ears, Mason knew that his life had already started to change, and he was ready to face whatever came next, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. This was his new beginning. Mason's life had begun to settle into a rhythm he hadn't expected. Small, comforting moments of connection, shared laughter, and a feeling of belonging he hadn't felt in years. The time he spent with Sarah and Ethan was changing him in ways he couldn't quite explain, but he knew he was no longer the man he used to be. He wasn't the solitary, distant CEO who had buried himself in work to escape pain. He was part of something, part of a family, even if it was still small and fragile. After the Christmas dinner, Mason began spending more time with Sarah and Ethan. They visited parks, took walks around the neighborhood, and enjoyed simple moments together. Ethan had become his little companion, always excited to show Mason his latest toys or to ask him questions that had no real answers, like whether a superhero could really fly or if dogs could understand human speech. But it was the way Ethan looked at him that kept Mason coming back, like he was someone worth looking up to, someone who had a place in his life. However, as Mason felt himself becoming more involved in their world, he knew something that Sarah wasn't ready to admit. There was still a part of her holding back. She had let him into her life in small ways, but there was still a wall between them, an invisible barrier that prevented her from fully trusting him. And Mason understood why. She had been hurt before, and he had no illusions about how difficult it was to let someone new into your life when you were already carrying so much baggage. It wasn't until one late afternoon, just before Christmas, that the full weight of Sarah's past came crashing into their fragile new dynamic. Mason had just finished a meeting at the office and was about to head home when he received a call from Sarah. Her voice was tight, strained. "Mason," she said quickly, her tone urgent, "I need you to come over now." The sharpness in her voice made his stomach drop. "What's wrong? Is everything okay?" There was a brief pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her words were rushed. It's him. He showed up. Mason's mind raced as he processed her words. He knew exactly who she meant. Her ex-husband, Daniel. "Where are you?" Mason asked, already grabbing his coat and keys. "I'm at the apartment. Please, Mason, I don't know what to do. He won't leave. I don't want Ethan to see him. I can't handle this right now." Mason didn't waste another second. He was already in his car, speeding toward Sarah's apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what this meant. Daniel wasn't just a problem from Sarah's past. He was a threat to everything she had worked so hard to protect. And now he had reappeared, uninvited and unwelcome. When Mason arrived at Sarah's apartment, he saw her standing by the door, her face pale, her posture stiff. Ethan was nowhere in sight, and that only made Mason's stomach tighten further. "I told him to leave," Sarah said quickly, her voice low, but there was a tremor to it that made Mason's heart ache. "But he wouldn't listen. He's not going anywhere unless I let him back in." Mason stepped toward her, his presence a silent reassurance. "You don't have to let him back in, Sarah. You don't owe him anything." She looked at him, her eyes wide, filled with a mix of fear and anger. I've tried to keep him away, but it's hard. He has a way of making me feel like I'm the one in the wrong, like I'm the one who should be sorry for leaving him." Her voice cracked, and Mason could see the weight of years of emotional turmoil pressing down on her. Mason reached out, gently touching her shoulder. "You're not the one in the wrong. You never were. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and Ethan. Don't let him make you doubt that." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for some kind of comfort. "I'm so tired, Mason," she whispered. "Tired of fighting him. Tired of dealing with him. I just want it all to stop." Mason's heart broke for her. He had no idea how difficult her life had been, how much she had endured to get to this point. He couldn't erase her past, but he could stand by her. He could be the person who wouldn't turn away when things got hard. "I'm here," he said firmly, his voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mason's body tensed, every muscle on alert. Sarah looked at him, her expression fearful. "He's here," she whispered. Mason nodded, walking toward the door. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Sarah face this alone. He opened the door slowly, revealing Daniel standing in the hallway. Daniel was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark coat that made him look even more imposing. His face was a mask of frustration, his eyes narrowed in anger. "Where's Sarah?" Daniel demanded, his voice low and aggressive. "She's right here," Mason said, his voice calm but firm. "And she doesn't want to talk to you right now." Daniel's gaze shifted to Mason, sizing him up in a way that made Mason feel like he was being measured for something he couldn't understand. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel sneered. "I'm someone who's here to make sure she's okay," Mason replied, his voice steady. "Now, I suggest you leave before things get ugly." Daniel stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "I don't take orders from you. This is my family. You think you can just waltz in and—" "Daniel, stop!" Sarah's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. She stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of calm. "You need to leave. Now. You don't get to just show up whenever you feel like it." Daniel's face twisted in anger, but he took a step back. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by Sarah. "This isn't over, Sarah," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll be back." Without another word, he turned and stormed off, disappearing down the hallway. Mason stood at the door, watching him go. His heart was still racing, but he felt a surge of relief. He had been ready for a confrontation, but he was glad it hadn't come to blows. When the door finally closed, Sarah let out a shaky breath, her body slumping against the frame. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Mason stepped forward, his presence a steady force as he wrapped his arm around her. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here for you. For both of you." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper. She didn't say anything, but Mason could see it in her gaze. She was beginning to trust him, and that trust, he realized, was everything. As Sarah stood in the doorway, looking out at the empty hallway, Mason stayed close by her side. The tension from Daniel's visit still hung in the air, but it was lighter now. For the first time, Sarah wasn't alone in this battle. And for the first time in a long while, Mason felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to his business or his past. It was tied to them, the family he had never expected, but that he would fight for with everything he had. They had a long road ahead, but Mason knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. And neither was Sarah. Not anymore. The days that followed Daniel's unexpected visit were a quiet relief. The immediate tension had dissipated, but a lingering unease still hung in the air, like a storm cloud that hadn't quite passed. Mason knew that Sarah's battle with her ex-husband wasn't over. Daniel had made that abundantly clear. But for now, she was safe. Ethan was safe. And Mason had proven that he wasn't going to run when things got tough. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Sarah's apartment, casting a warm glow over the cozy living room. Ethan was sitting on the floor, surrounded by toys, while Sarah moved about the kitchen, preparing dinner. Mason sat on the couch, trying to read a report for work, though his attention kept drifting to the peaceful scene unfolding before him. It was moments like this, simple, quiet moments, that made Mason realize just how much he had been missing. He had spent so many years consumed by the demands of his business, believing that success was the key to happiness. But now, sitting here with Sarah and Ethan, he saw how misguided that had been. True happiness, he realized, came from connection, from being there for the people who mattered. And in this small apartment, with the scent of homemade food filling the air, he felt a warmth that was more fulfilling than any deal he had ever closed. Ethan looked up from his toys, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Mason, can you help me with this?" he asked, holding up a set of building blocks. "I'm trying to build a really big tower." Mason smiled, setting aside his report. "Of course, let's see what we can do." He moved to the floor, kneeling beside Ethan, and together they began stacking the blocks. Ethan's excitement was contagious, and before long they had a tower that was taller than either of them had expected. They both sat back and admired their creation. "I think we should make it even bigger," Ethan said eagerly, his face lighting up with excitement. "Well," Mason said, looking over at Sarah, who had been watching them from the kitchen, "if you think we can do it, then we'll give it a try." Sarah smiled at them both, her expression softening as she watched Mason interact with Ethan. It was a small thing, but it meant more than words could say. There was something in Sarah's eyes, a flicker of something that told Mason that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see him in a different light. After a while, Sarah called them to the dinner table, the room filled with the smell of roasted chicken, vegetables, and the warm comfort of a homemade meal. They sat down together, the three of them, and for the first time in a long time, Mason felt like he belonged. Ethan talked excitedly about his day at school, telling Mason all about his new friends and the games they played during recess. Sarah listened, adding a comment here and there, but mostly letting Ethan take the lead. It was easy, comfortable, and Mason found himself laughing along with them, feeling the connection that had been growing stronger between them. It was moments like these that made him realize just how much he wanted this, wanted them. There was a quiet strength in Sarah that he admired, and Ethan's innocence and trust made him want to be the man they deserved. He hadn't expected any of this when he first met them, but now he couldn't imagine his life without them. The evening passed slowly, with more laughter and shared moments around the dinner table. Sarah cleaned up while Mason and Ethan played a board game that had been left out from earlier. They weren't doing anything special, but to Mason, it felt like everything he had ever needed. When dinner was finished and the dishes were cleared away, Sarah sat down beside Mason on the couch, her body language relaxed. She wasn't holding back anymore. She wasn't as guarded as she had been when they first met. "I've been thinking about everything," Sarah said quietly, her voice low, as though she was testing the waters. "About you, about us." Mason's heart skipped. He hadn't expected her to bring this up so soon. He had always been cautious, afraid of pushing her too quickly, but now it seemed like she was ready to speak her truth. "I'm not good at this," she continued, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Opening up, letting someone in. I've been hurt before, and it's hard to trust again." Mason's stomach twisted. He understood her hesitation. He knew that kind of pain. He had felt it himself, time and time again, but he also knew that trust, once given, could be the foundation for something real. He didn't need her to have all the answers. He just needed her to see that he was willing to be there, to give her the time and space she needed. No," Mason said softly, his voice steady but full of understanding. "I get it. I've been where you are. But I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I'm here, and I'm not going to leave." She met his gaze then, her eyes searching his face. There was something in them, something that made Mason's heart swell with hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He didn't want to face it alone, and he didn't want her to face it alone either. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was a quiet understanding, an unspoken promise that they would take this journey together, one step at a time. As the evening wore on, Sarah stood to get a blanket from the closet for Ethan, who had curled up on the couch, clearly ready to sleep. Mason remained seated, his thoughts a mix of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. But then, as Sarah walked past him, she stopped. She looked down at him for a long moment, as though considering something, before she finally spoke. "Thank you, Mason," she said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "For everything. For showing up. For not running." Mason smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Sarah. I'm here because I want to be." She smiled back, the warmth in her eyes speaking volumes. And as she turned to leave the room, Mason felt a quiet certainty settle within him. This was just the beginning, and whatever came next, he was ready. The sound of Ethan's soft breathing filled the room as the night settled in. Mason stayed there, on the couch, his thoughts drifting to the future. The uncertainty of it all still lingered, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been before. With Sarah and Ethan by his side, he realized that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. And for the first time in a long time, Mason felt like he had found where he truly belonged. The morning light poured through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow over the small living room of Sarah's apartment. Mason woke up early, as he often did, the quiet of the morning his moment of reflection before the world outside demanded his attention. He had stayed at Sarah's longer than usual the night before. Something about the calm of being with them had made him reluctant to leave. He hadn't felt like this in a long time, connected, grounded, like his life was moving in a direction he never expected. As he sat on the couch, his thoughts wandered to Sarah and Ethan. He had always known that he had a big heart, but he didn't realize just how much it had been missing something until he met them. Ethan's innocent joy, his easy trust, and Sarah's quiet strength had given him a new purpose, something beyond the cold walls of his office or the ticking clock of business deals. They had offered him the chance to be part of something real, something lasting, and he was willing to fight for that, fight for them. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Ethan padded into the living room, rubbing his eyes. His little face was still puffy from sleep, but there was a grin on his lips that could light up any room. "Good morning, Mason," Ethan said, his voice full of energy, even though it was early. Mason chuckled, glancing up from his thoughts. "Good morning, buddy. You sleep well?" Ethan nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I had a dream that I was flying like a superhero. It was awesome." He threw his arms out as if demonstrating his flight. Mason laughed, the sound rich with affection. He couldn't help but be charmed by Ethan's boundless energy. It was so different from his own childhood, where everything was always calculated and serious. But with Ethan, it was different. Life was an adventure, full of wonder and possibility. "Flying, huh? That sounds pretty amazing," Mason said, his voice warm. "Maybe one day you can teach me how to do that." Ethan looked at him, eyes wide with excitement. "Really, you'll learn with me?" "I'll try my best," Mason replied with a smile. "But I'm guessing we'll need a good cape for that, don't you think?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "Yeah, definitely. Every superhero needs a cape." At that moment, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her face still soft with sleep, but radiating a quiet beauty that Mason couldn't help but notice. She smiled when she saw him and Ethan, her eyes softening. "Morning," she said, her voice still hushed from sleep. "Looks like someone's already awake and full of energy." Ethan beamed. "I was telling Mason all about my dream where I was flying like a superhero." Sarah smiled warmly, walking over to the kitchen counter to prepare breakfast. "You're always dreaming up new adventures, aren't you?" she said as she grabbed a few ingredients from the counter. Mason watched her for a moment, noting the way she moved, efficient, calm, yet still graceful. It was in these quiet moments that he saw the full extent of Sarah's strength. She was a woman who had been through so much, yet here she was, doing everything she could to give her son the best life possible. She never asked for help, never expected it, and yet she had accepted him into her life, into this fragile little family they were building. Mason knew there was so much more to Sarah than met the eye, but he also knew that, in time, she would open up more. He just had to be patient. He got up from the couch, walking over to where she was and offering his help. "Let me help with breakfast," he said. "You've been doing so much for Ethan. I think it's time I pitch in." Sarah glanced up at him, surprised but pleased. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I've got it covered." Mason smiled, his voice low. "I know, but I want to help. Besides, we're a team, right? Families help each other." At that, Sarah's smile grew, though there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, something that made Mason's chest tighten. He wasn't sure what it was, but it made him realize that Sarah had started to trust him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was letting him into her life, piece by piece, even if it wasn't easy for her. "Okay," she said, setting down the eggs and walking over to the stove. "Just don't burn anything." Mason chuckled. "I'll do my best," he replied, stepping up to the stove and carefully cracking eggs into the pan. The rest of the morning passed in a comfortable rhythm. They shared breakfast together, simple, but warm, and talked about nothing in particular. Ethan's energy was contagious, and even Sarah seemed more at ease. Her shoulders relaxed as she watched them interact. Mason felt a deep sense of satisfaction, something he hadn't realized he was missing until now. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk in the nearby park. It was one of those crisp winter mornings where the air felt fresh and clean, and the sun shone brightly in the clear blue sky. As they walked, Ethan skipped ahead, running from tree to tree and laughing as he picked up fallen leaves and sticks. Mason and Sarah walked side by side, just a few steps apart, but in the comfortable silence that had come to define their growing relationship. "This is nice," Sarah said after a while, her voice thoughtful. "I can't remember the last time I just walked like this. It feels peaceful." Mason looked over at her, surprised at how natural it felt to be in her presence. There was still so much they hadn't said to each other, so much left unspoken. But in this moment, he didn't need words. He simply wanted to enjoy the moment with her, to share it with Ethan, to be part of something that felt bigger than all the obstacles they had faced. "I think we should do this more often," Mason said, his voice steady but full of quiet meaning. "Walk together, I mean. I don't think it matters where we're going, as long as we're going there together." Sarah looked at him, her eyes soft. She opened her mouth as though to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she gave a small nod, as if the simple truth of what he'd said was enough for her to understand. The afternoon passed quickly, with more play and laughter. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, they made their way back to the apartment. Mason felt a sense of contentment that was new to him, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he had finally found where he was supposed to be. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Mason realized something profound. It wasn't just about being there for Sarah and Ethan. It wasn't just about helping with small tasks or fixing things. It was about the quiet moments, the shared smiles, the feeling of being a part of something larger than himself, something that didn't require him to be perfect, but just to show up. As they finished their meal and Ethan yawned, clearly ready for bed, Mason helped him with his jacket. Before Ethan could disappear into his room, he turned to Mason with a bright smile. "Good night, Mason." Ethan said, "You're my friend." Mason's heart swelled. "Good night, buddy. I'm glad we're friends." Ethan ran off to bed, and Mason looked over at Sarah, who was watching him, her eyes full of quiet gratitude. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, "but I'm glad you're here. I didn't think I would ever find someone who could be a part of our lives, but here you are." Mason smiled softly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah, I promise." For the first time in a long time, Mason felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the evening came to a close, Mason found himself standing in the doorway of Sarah's apartment, looking out at the quiet city street. The stars shone brightly above, and the world felt peaceful, as if everything was exactly as it should be. He turned to Sarah, who stood beside him, her expression soft. "This is the start of something good," Mason said quietly, more to himself than to her. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with something that was hard to name. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of something deeper. "Yeah," she replied softly. "I think it is." And in that moment, Mason knew that everything was about to change. For the better. The weeks following Christmas seemed to pass in a blur, each day blending into the next in the most comforting way. The three of them, Mason, Sarah, and Ethan, had settled into a routine, one that was simple yet filled with moments that Mason never wanted to end. The small acts of kindness, the shared laughter, the quiet companionship. They were all beginning to feel like home to him. For Mason, every moment spent with Sarah and Ethan was a gift, a chance to heal, to rediscover what it meant to be a part of something bigger than himself. But despite the warmth and connection he felt, there was still one thing he hadn't fully addressed, the part of Sarah's life that had cast a shadow over everything they had built so far. Her ex-husband, Daniel. Mason knew Sarah was trying to move on, trying to leave the past behind, but he also knew that Daniel wasn't going to let go so easily. The tension from their last confrontation still hung in the air, and Mason could sense that Sarah was only just beginning to process the emotional toll her past had taken on her. She hadn't opened up much about the details of her relationship with Daniel, but Mason knew it was something she wasn't ready to revisit. Yet, as their relationship deepened, Mason couldn't help but wonder if the time had come for her to face her past, and for him to be there to support her through it. It was a Sunday afternoon when Sarah finally mentioned it. They had just finished lunch, a quiet, comforting meal of homemade soup and bread, and Ethan had run off to play with his toys in his room. The apartment was calm, peaceful, but Sarah seemed distant, her mind somewhere else. She sat at the kitchen table, stirring her cup of coffee absent-mindedly, her eyes unfocused. Mason sat across from her, watching her closely. There was something about the way she held herself, something that told him she was struggling with something she wasn't ready to say. He had learned over the past few weeks how to read her silences, the way she pulled inward when something bothered her, the way her shoulders would tighten ever so slightly. It was a familiar pattern, one that he understood all too well. "Sarah," Mason said softly, his voice gentle but insistent. "What's on your mind?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but closed it again, as though the words were caught somewhere deep inside her. "I've been thinking a lot," she said finally, her voice low, almost apologetic. "About Daniel." Mason's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to hit him so directly. He kept his expression calm, even though his mind was racing. "What about him?" Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I've been avoiding him for so long, trying to keep him out of our lives, but I don't know. He's still a part of me, whether I want him to be or not." She looked at Mason, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for some kind of reassurance. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when there's so much of my past that I haven't dealt with. And I don't want it to keep affecting us." Mason leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "You don't have to deal with it alone, Sarah. Whatever you're facing, I'm here." She swallowed, her gaze dropping to her coffee. "I don't know if I can face it all," she admitted quietly. "It's easier to keep it buried, you know? But I think Ethan deserves more than that. He deserves a mother who's fully present, who isn't always holding back." Mason's heart went out to her. He had seen the weight she carried, the way she tried so hard to protect Ethan, to keep him safe from the emotional scars of her past. But he also knew that healing couldn't happen without confronting the pain. And while Sarah might not be ready to face everything, Mason knew he had to be there for her when she did. "You don't have to do it all at once," Mason said, his voice steady and calm. "We'll take it one step at a time, okay? You don't have to face everything all at once." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. She was still holding on to something, still afraid to fully let go, but for the first time, Mason could see that she was willing to try. "I don't know how to do this," she said softly. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Mason reached across the table, and gently took her hand in his. "You are," he said quietly. "You've been strong enough all along, and you don't have to do it alone. I'm right here." The days that followed were filled with small but significant moments. Sarah began to open up more, sharing bits and pieces of her past with Mason. She told him about the early days of her relationship with Daniel, the way he had been charming at first, how they had fallen in love, how everything had seemed perfect. But then, over time, things had started to change. The emotional manipulation, the isolation, the subtle control, everything had shifted, and Sarah had found herself trapped in a cycle she couldn't break free from. It hadn't been until Ethan was born that she realized she had to get out. She had to protect him, protect herself. And in the end, that had meant walking away from a marriage that had left her broken. But walking away wasn't as easy as it sounded. Daniel had tried to make her feel guilty, had tried to manipulate her into coming back. And even now, after all this time, he still found ways to invade her life. Mason listened patiently, his heart heavy with each word she spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions. He simply let her speak, knowing that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was to listen. The next day, as Mason sat in his office, the phone buzzed on his desk. It was Sarah. "Mason, Daniel's back. He's threatening to take me to court for custody of Ethan." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had feared this moment would come, but now that it was here, the reality felt like a weight pressing down on him. Sarah and Ethan had just started to find peace, and now it was all in jeopardy. Mason didn't hesitate. He stood up, grabbing his coat and his car keys. He had no idea what Daniel was capable of, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Sarah and Ethan face this alone. Mason arrived at Sarah's apartment as quickly as he could, his mind racing. When he walked in, Sarah was pacing in the living room, her face drawn with worry. Ethan was sitting quietly on the couch, looking up at his mother with a concerned expression. "He said he's taking me to court," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. "I don't know what to do, Mason. I don't know if I can fight him. He's always had control over me, and now he's using Ethan as leverage." Mason walked over to her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice firm. "You don't have to face him alone." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "I don't want to lose him, Mason. I can't." "You won't," Mason said, his voice unwavering. "I'll make sure of it. We'll fight together." In that moment, Sarah's eyes softened, and Mason knew she had taken the first step toward truly trusting him. He wasn't just offering support, he was offering a partnership. And for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. And together, they would face whatever came next. As the sun set outside the apartment window, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, Mason stood by the door, watching Sarah and Ethan. They were a family, even if they weren't yet sure how to navigate the storm ahead. But one thing was certain. Mason wasn't going anywhere. He was going to fight for them, whatever it took. And together they would find a way through it. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, legal paperwork, and sleepless nights. Mason had never imagined he would be in a situation like this, fighting for a family he wasn't even sure was fully his. But here he was, standing beside Sarah, trying to make sense of the chaos Daniel had thrown into their lives. Sarah's ex-husband, Daniel, had filed for custody of Ethan, claiming that she wasn't fit to be a mother. His words were full of venom, accusing her of being emotionally unstable, of not providing the right kind of home for their son. It was an all-too-familiar play from someone who thrived on control and manipulation. Sarah had kept her composure when she told Mason about the legal papers, but Mason could see the cracks forming beneath her calm exterior. She was terrified. The thought of losing Ethan, the one bright spot in her life, was a fear she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge. But now it was a real, looming threat. "I'm not going to let him take you and Ethan away," Mason had said firmly when they sat down to discuss their next steps. "We'll fight this together." Sarah had nodded, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice strained. "I've been trying to keep everything together, and now it feels like everything is falling apart again." Mason had reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to do it alone anymore. I'm with you every step of the way." The next morning, Mason drove Sarah to her lawyer's office. As they entered the building, Sarah seemed quieter than usual, her nerves visible despite her attempt at a composed demeanor. Ethan was at school, and for the first time in days, Sarah had a moment of peace, but the anxiety she felt was palpable. Mason could tell she was struggling with the weight of it all. He had seen it in her eyes, the fear of what would happen if they didn't win, the worry about how it would affect Ethan. But as they entered the lawyer's office, Mason stood beside her, silently offering the support she needed without saying a word. "Ms. Johnson." The lawyer greeted them as they sat down. She was a professional woman, probably in her late 40s, with sharp features and an air of authority that immediately put Mason at ease. "I've reviewed the documents Daniel's lawyer filed, and I must say his claims are baseless. We'll be filing a counterclaim, but it's going to take time." "I can't lose him," Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion. "Ethan means everything to me. I won't let him use him against me." The lawyer nodded. "We'll do everything we can to ensure that doesn't happen. But I need you to stay strong, Sarah. It's going to be a battle, and I can't promise it'll be quick." Mason's heart clenched at the raw vulnerability in Sarah's voice. She was so used to fighting alone, so used to carrying the weight of everything herself. But she wasn't alone now. They weren't going to let Daniel win. The days turned into weeks, with the legal battle dragging on longer than Mason had expected. There were court dates, depositions, and endless paperwork. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but Mason was there every step of the way. He drove Sarah to the hearings, helped her prepare for meetings with her lawyer, and spent hours comforting her when the weight of it all became too much to bear. Through it all, they grew closer. Mason saw sides of Sarah he had never expected to see. The vulnerability, the raw emotion she kept hidden from the world. But he also saw her strength. Despite everything, she fought for Ethan with everything she had. She was fierce, protective, and loving. And Mason was falling for her more deeply with every passing day. One night, after another long day of legal meetings, they sat on the couch together, Sarah leaning against Mason's shoulder as they watched a movie with Ethan. It was simple, peaceful, everything that Mason had come to crave. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason turned his head to look at her, his heart swelling with affection. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here because I want to be. You and Ethan are everything." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes searching his. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had grown stronger with every challenge they faced together. As the movie ended, they sat in comfortable silence for a while. Ethan had already fallen asleep, his head resting on Sarah's lap. The sight made Mason's heart ache, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something real. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was ready to face it. And as long as Sarah and Ethan were by his side, he would keep fighting, no matter what came next. As Mason sat there, with Sarah and Ethan beside him, He realized that this was what he had been waiting for all along. He didn't need to be the man he had once been, the powerful CEO, the man who ran his business with precision and control. He didn't need any of that anymore. What he needed was right in front of him, and he was willing to fight for it. "Whatever happens, we'll be okay," Mason said softly, his voice steady with conviction. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something that told Mason that they were both ready to move forward together. "We will," she said, her voice quiet but full of strength. And for the first time in a long time, Mason believed it. They would be okay, because together they were stronger than any challenge life could throw their way. The weeks following the court hearings were tense, but there was a shift in the air. Despite the stress of the ongoing battle with Daniel, something had changed between Mason, Sarah, and Ethan. They had become a true family in every sense of the word, built on trust, shared moments, and the quiet strength that came from knowing they could face anything together. One afternoon, Mason found himself sitting with Sarah in the small living room, Ethan curled up beside them as they watched a movie. He looked over at Sarah, who was absent-mindedly tracing her fingers over the armrest of the couch. There was a sense of peace about her now, something he hadn't seen before. "I'm starting to think we might actually win this," she said, her voice low, a hint of hope in her tone that Mason hadn't heard in weeks. Mason squeezed her hand gently. "We're in this together. We'll get through it." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us." Mason smiled, leaning closer. "There's no going back now. We're a team." And for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe it. They were a team. The future wasn't so uncertain anymore. Together, they could handle whatever came next. The following week brought a new sense of determination to Sarah and Mason. The legal battle was far from over, but they were beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Sarah's lawyer had gathered enough evidence to challenge Daniel's claims, and Mason, ever the steady presence, had been by her side, offering unwavering support. One evening, as they sat together on the couch after a long day, Sarah leaned her head on Mason's shoulder, her body finally relaxing in a way it hadn't in months. Ethan was in bed, already asleep, leaving them a rare moment of quiet. "I never imagined it would feel like this," Sarah whispered. "Like things might actually be okay." Mason smiled softly, his hand resting on hers. "You deserve peace, Sarah. You deserve everything good that's coming." She lifted her head to meet his gaze, her eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude, something that spoke of shared hope, of trust, and of the family they were building together. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Mason gently squeezed her hand. "We're in this together. Always." And in that moment, Sarah believed him. They were stronger than they had ever been before, united, ready for whatever came next. The days leading up to the final court date were filled with nervous energy, but Mason could feel a shift in the air. Sarah had grown stronger with each passing day, her resolve hardening as they prepared for the final step in their fight. Mason had been there for every legal consultation, every conversation, every moment of doubt. But now, there was a quiet confidence in Sarah that he hadn't seen before. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Sarah turned to him, her eyes determined, yet filled with a warmth that made Mason's heart swell. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said softly, her voice steady. Mason smiled, proud of her strength. "We've got this. No matter what happens, we've already won. We've built something real here." Sarah reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Mason leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "You don't need to thank me. We're a family. That's all that matters." In that moment, with the weight of their struggles behind them and hope for the future ahead, they both knew the hardest part was over. Whatever the outcome, they had already won, together. The courtroom was quiet, the tension thick in the air as Sarah, Mason, and their lawyer sat in anticipation. The final hearing was here, the culmination of months of emotional battles, long days, and sleepless nights. Mason could feel Sarah's hand trembling in his as they waited for the judge to enter. Ethan wasn't there. Sarah had decided it was best for him to stay home, away from the stress of the proceedings. Mason glanced at Sarah, who was sitting beside him, her face pale but determined. Her eyes, however, told a different story, deep pools of fear mixed with a flicker of hope. He squeezed her hand, offering silent support. He had been with her every step of the way, and he wasn't about to let her face this alone. "Whatever happens in there," Mason said quietly, his voice steady, "we've already built something incredible. You and Ethan are my world now." Sarah met his gaze, her lips parting as if to say something, but then falling silent, her eyes welling with tears. The judge entered, and the room stood still. After what felt like an eternity, the hearing began, each side presenting their case. Daniel's lawyer argued fiercely, but Sarah's lawyer was calm and collected, dismantling the accusations piece by piece. The final words were spoken, and the room fell silent again. Hours later, as they waited for the judge's decision, Mason could feel the weight of the moment settling in. And then it came. The judge's ruling. The custody battle was over. Sarah was awarded full custody of Ethan. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she hugged Mason tightly. "We did it," she whispered. And for the first time in months, the weight lifted off her shoulders. Sarah, Mason, and Ethan, finally free. A new chapter had begun. They were no longer defined by the past. They were a family, stronger than ever, and ready to face whatever came next, together. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a peaceful rhythm for Mason, Sarah, and Ethan. The tension of the past had finally eased, and now they were free to enjoy the quiet joys of their new life together. Mason stood beside Sarah one evening as they watched Ethan play in the yard, his laughter echoing in the air. Sarah leaned against him, a soft smile on her face. "This is it," she whispered. "This is everything I've always wanted." Mason wrapped his arm around her. "And this is just the beginning." Together, they embraced the future, ready for whatever came next. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.